The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation. Constituency Report is produced as a public service by members of the BC Legislature through the facilities of Shaw TV.
Welcome to Constituency Report. I'm here with Andrew Weaver, the MLA for Oak Bay Gordon Head and leader of the BC Green Party. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, Judy.
In this report, we talk about issues that we are hearing about in our constituency and also issues that are currently in the legislature. So to start off, we'll talk about some local issues. And one that's received a lot of local attention lately is derelict vessels in Cadboro Bay, where the Saanich and Oak Bay municipalities' borders meet. Recently, derelicts in Oak Bay were removed in a move led by local citizens and the Cadboro Bay Residents Association. You've been working on this file for quite a while, Andrew, about 2 years, I think. How did the recent removal of derelicts come about?
Well, it's a very complex issue, the whole issue of derelict vessels, of course, because a boat in the water is on federal jurisdiction. A boat in the intertidal zone slips into a provincial jurisdiction, and a boat on land, it falls into municipal jurisdiction. And what has happened here historically is that everyone points fingers at everyone else and says, and the net result is nothing gets done. Well, Saanich were quite progressive in this. I mean, we really, it is a federal responsibility. Saanich took steps in partnership with the province to have boats eliminated in a cost-sharing exercise. There's a citizen there, Eric Daly, who's been persistent on this, persistent in Saanich, and so persistent in my office, we kind of nicknamed him, or he nicknamed himself, the Royal Pain, because he was so effective. But so before the election, I tried to get an agreement to move forward collectively with Oak Bay and the province in a manner that mirrored the Saanich agreement, and I had a commitment from the province prior to the election that they would be willing to partner in that regard. Election came, turmoil, and then finally was able to get this issue back on the new government's table. And Kevin Murdoch deserves a ton of credit. Kevin Murdoch, the acting mayor in the summer, I met with him and I pointed out that the money's there in the province. What we need is a commitment from Oak Bay Council to do their little bit. And so Oak Bay Council approved $4,000. The province, I believe, added another $12,000, and through the volunteers of every community, those boats are removed. Now, the reality is the federal government should be paying all of it. The federal government, it is ultimately boats that are in their jurisdiction that ended up on our beaches. And so, frankly, I think both municipalities and the province should send the bill to the feds.
So we frequently hear from constituents about health issues in the riding of Oak Bay Gordon Head. In particular, we hear about wait times for surgeries and the lack of general practitioners accepting new patients. No doctors are accepting new patients in southern Vancouver Island, south of Mill Bay. How have we found ourselves in this bad situation with the lack of family doctors?
You know, there's a couple of problems here. One of the problems is that we haven't recognized that times have changed. What do I mean by that is that as we've added greater and greater amounts of responsibility onto GPs, and we're finding that young doctors are not wanting to go into that area. So we find that many young doctors choose to, because of lifestyle issues, choose to simply not want to take on the management that goes with your general practice. You know, we have to recognize that. I've met with many med students and organizations is that there's an appetite out there for salaried doctors who want to be GPs, but they don't want to be administrators. Any GP you'll talk to will spend at least one of the 5 days a week doing paperwork, and we could just increase the burden of that paperwork through growing bureaucracies in our healthcare system. You know, if we can help doctors be doctors, we'll find more people want to be doctors, general practitioners, because they want to heal people. They don't want to fill out forms. At the same time, you know, there's also an awareness that there's an emerging field that we really need to get around, and these are the nurse practitioners. But the problem we have in BC is that we have a billing system that does not allow nurse practitioners to bill for their services, and doctors have in this top-heavy bureaucracy, have a fee for service. So we can't really fit nurse practitioners into the traditional healthcare mode unless something like an Island Health or a Fraser Valley Health Authority brings a nurse practitioner onto their staff. But then, of course, there's a resistance there because it's coming out of a different budget. So really, we've got to stand back and say, does it really make sense to continue throwing money at a system without actually taking a look at the foundation of that system? How is it we can make doctors doctors, let doctors be doctors, allow nurse practitioners, allow team-based approaches of people working in centres and teams? How can we facilitate that? And rather than trying to keep up an archaic model, one that we're finding it more difficult to fill with young people. So I'm optimistic we'll see this change shortly, but it'll take time, but I feel there's goodwill all around on this file.
And recently, we were horrified to hear of another mass shooting in the U.S., this time in Las Vegas, and the worst mass shooting in U.S. history, with 59 people killed and over 500 people injured, and while they were attending an outdoor country music festival. And we learned shortly after the news broke that one of the people that was a victim of the shooting was a constituent of Oak Bay Gordon Head, Sheldon Mack, who was in Las Vegas with a couple of his buddies celebrating his 21st birthday. So we're very relieved to know that Sheldon survived the 2 gunshot wounds after having major emergency surgery, and that he's now home in Victoria. It's disturbing to hear such events, and it really brings it home when it's actually someone that we know. How did you react when you heard this news, and what did you do?
Well, as you know, Judy, you've been best of friends with Patty Mack for quite some time. I know Patty and Hudson very, very well. Our kids went to Campus View Elementary School together, so they're like part of the Campus View family. We've known them for years. Hudson was the guy when he was A-Channel at the time, anchor. We put the weather stations collectively in partnership on all the schools in Vancouver Island. So very good friends. To hear it, Sheldon, just it shocks you because it can be anybody. It's a kid going down to celebrate his birthday, gets shot, and the stomach shot was incredibly serious. I mean, I've read some of the emails that Patty sent you. To know he's lucky to be here today. He's lucky that a paramedic, literally a paramedic, was beside him and was able to put his elbow into his wound to keep the blood, so that when he went into ICU that night, they were able to get him, stable. He's a lucky man, and it just shows us, how precarious things are, and I'm looking forward to bringing him to the ledge in the fall. I understand the paramedic may be coming up to visit. I'd love to get him down here, introduce him to the legislature, and because the story it's a sad story, but it's a sad story that shows both the worst aspects of humanity, but also the very best, in that what we find from that paramedic and the love of his family. It's truly a remarkable story that I'd love to tell the people here in the legislature.
Indeed, and the heroes in these events, and Sheldon himself was saving a young woman who'd been shot and fallen next to him when he was then shot, and so we're so grateful and relieved, and can't imagine what Hudson and Patty must have gone through that night as they were trying to get themselves down there and find out if he was okay.
Right. All you hear is that your son is in ICU, and how do you feel about that? I don't know how they did it. It'll be tough road to recovery too, because there's a short-term reaction and I'm better now, but then there's the longer term recovery, and that'll involve dealing with mental health, because it's not something that you don't just get shot twice or nearly lose your child and not have it really affect you. So I'm hoping that they take time, Patty and Hudson, with Sheldon to reflect upon this, and they come out stronger as a family unit together.
Yeah, absolutely, and a shout out to the Macs, the whole family, we're so grateful that everything's that Sheldon's on the road to recovery. Switching gears, recently the government gave a $100 monthly increase to basic social assistance rates, and also to the rate for people with disabilities. As well, the bus pass program provided to persons with disabilities was reinstated after being taken away by the previous government. Did you support this? And can you tell us why?
Yeah, obviously, I was very supportive of this issue. You know, I was asked on a radio station late last week to rate the government's performance, and I overall I gave them to date a high A, pointing out that there were some areas like ride sharing where I gave them an F, and other areas like housing where I gave them a C. You know, 64% and 48%. On social issues, I'll give them an A plus, 95%. I say that as a former academic. They've really taken this file and they've done what they said they would do. Both the BC Greens and the BC NDP campaigned on raising these rates, and they did so in a timely fashion. And I think it was the right thing to do. You know, having disability rates, having social assistance rates not increase for a decade, that's mean-spirited. Anyone who's tried to rent with the money that people had accessible to rent would find it was literally impossible. So I'm very supportive of this.
It's been a very eventful time in the legislature since the general election in May 2017. We have the first elected Green Party caucus in North America. So how's that been for you so far, and particularly the addition of 2 Green MLAs working alongside you?
It's we've been. I mean, I'm thrilled. I'm not normally speechless, but you saw I'm almost speechless there. Is that it has been such an honor to be elected for the 3 of us, and that we have the burden of responsibility here to ensure that we're responsible with the position we're in. We don't try to ram our agenda through and act recklessly in the legislature, but at the same time we're there to hold government to account, to ensure that they don't overlook issues. So it's a very, very fascinating, rewarding position to be in. We're not in government, we're in a minority government, there's no coalition, but so we have to at all times walk the line of, on the one hand, criticizing government when they're doing things we don't support, and at the same time praising government when they're doing things that we do support. And that actually, that's I feel okay doing that, because it's essentially who I am. It's who Sonia is, who Adam is that we believe, you know, criticism is easy, but unless you're offering alternate solutions, you really should just not criticize for the sake of it. Criticize and say what you do instead, and that's the approach we're going to take.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it must have been quite an incredible feeling that night, on election night, when you realized the reality of the BC Greens holding the balance of power. And so we will talk about that a little bit more after the break when we return with Constituency Report. Welcome back to Constituency Report with Andrew Weaver, MLA for Oakbay-Gordon Head and leader of the BC Green Party. Andrew, regarding CASA, what we've come to know as the acronym for Confidence and Supply Agreement between the BC Green Caucus and the BC NDP government. We want to take a look at what CASA is and what it isn't. It's not a coalition agreement, and the BC Greens sit in opposition to the NDP. Can you please explain what this means?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, Judy, because a lot of people seem to think that there's a coalition government. There isn't. I recognize that a lot of the Liberals message out the coalition, and they're just confusing people. The reality is we are in a minority government situation where the present government, the BC NDP, has the support of the majority of the MLAs in the House. So the confidence and supply agreement was an important part of that. And for people who are interested, a similar agreement was just signed in New Zealand between the New Zealand Labour Party and the New Zealand Green Party, and others have existed historically, like in Ontario as well. So why it's critical is that it's when you're in a minority government situation, you want to ensure that you're able to give certainty to business and to the people of the province. Business and certainty is critical. If the government could fall on any given day because of any given issue, that's not a very stable situation to be in. So immediately after the election, when it was clear that the BC Greens had held the balance of power, or the balance of responsibility, as we like to say it, we entered into discussions with both the BC NDP and in parallel with the BC Liberals to determine the extent that we could find shared values that we could agree upon and build upon. And so we went down both paths, and ultimately we ended up agreeing that if this was going to work best with the BC NDP, because there were several issues that we felt the BC Liberals were not going to be able to take to the kind of decisions that we wanted to see. Climate change, for example, proportional representation, banning big money. So we still had some concerns about where these were going, the Kinder Mountain pipeline. So, while of course, as we saw in the throne speech, some of those, Liberals came a long way on a number of these issues. We felt it was important to put them in a timeout, is what we like to say, because it became obvious to me that the BC Liberals had been in power too long, and with power in your hands for too long, you start to govern with a sense of entitlement. You can do no wrong, and we started to see them get sloppy, starting to put not thinking through some of their policies, fixating on a non-existent industry, that's LNG, and so forth. So it was important that they were given a timeout. They're going through a leadership review now. We'll see what happens. So our agreement with the NDP, the CASA agreement, means that we will support them on budgetary issues and on confidence issue. So confidence and supply but we still are free to vote against anything that we don't want. And I've been public on a number of things that we don't support. We didn't support the removing of the tolls in Vancouver. We were the only party that didn't. That's not something that's done through legislation. It's done through order in council. So it's not something that we could stop once the government's there. Both parties were going to do it. There's other things that I've talked about, is card check versus secret ballot for union certification. There'll be other things that you'll see come up probably even this term. And so we have agreed on the high level principles. And we've also agreed that we want to work together. We want everyone to work together. And we've agreed, and fundamentally in that agreement, to have good faith and no surprises. So while I will freely criticize government policy, typically trying to offer solutions instead, we would give them a heads up. Well, let's say, for example, we're told that the BC NDP are going to, build a bridge from A to B, and we think that that's reckless fiscal mismanagement. We'll tell them, look, they're no surprise. They tell us we're going to announce building a bridge, and we'll say, look, we're going to give you. We don't believe that. We're going to make it known our objections. Let the court of the public jury determine whether they support it. We'll reflect our views. They'll reflect theirs, and at the end of the day, we'll still work together. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what people want. People want adults to be in the room and work together. And if anyone said, it was tough for me to get there too. I didn't just walk into this, because anyone who followed the campaign closely would have seen that there was quite a targeted attack on me by the BC NDP and some of their partisan supporters, and some of them were very personal. And so it was not easy to come to make this step, to realize that we had to do what's right for British Columbians, but we did collectively do it. And I'm just thrilled the way it's working out. I have a lot of time for John Horgan. I think he's a good premier, and Carol James. We've got great working relationship, George Heyman, and others as well. Mm-hmm.
But you did feel yourself in the Green Caucus that it was necessary. The BC Greens couldn't remain independent and vote on legislation on an issue-by-issue basis.
Well, the problem there is we can do that on various bills, but what a lot of people may not realize is that bills that are being introduced have our fingers on them already, because in terms of a good faith and no surprises, we're able to provide our input. If there's going to be a ban big money, we'll put our input in as to what we'd like to see, and we can still vote on bills on a case by case basis. But what we've agreed to is give confidence to the government. We could not we had to sign an agreement with someone. Otherwise, there would be tumultuous times of uncertainty in British Columbia, and that was not healthy for anybody.
So if we can talk a little bit about the minority government and how minority government is functioning in BC in your view, and the advantages to minority government.
I think it's working out very well, and I say that because agendas cannot be driven. In our first past the post system, it's basically winner take all. I go to the 2013 provincial election where the BC Liberals received less than 1 in 4 registered voters supporting them. So they've got less than 25% of registered voters supporting them because the turnout was so low. But they have 100% of the power. So what you would see is you could just do anything you want. You just ram through decisions. If you like debate, you listen. If not, you shut it down. You control that. Minority governments, you can't do that. It forces people to work together. And I'm finding right now that the BC Liberals don't know. They're kind of struggling here to recognize that we have a new paradigm here, and they're still not really getting it, that we are trying to work together. The David Eby's team has granted legislative drafters for opposition MLAs. Like, that's unheard of. And that's a remarkable step forward in terms of improving our democracy, allowing us access to the legislative drafters for amendments to government bills to ensure that those amendments, if and when introduced, reflect the multitude of legislation that already is on the paper. So that's an incredible step forward. So I think people of British Columbia should be very excited about what's going on. You know, they may not like every decision, I get that, but they're in the collective. You know, while I say I gave them an F on ride sharing and a C on housing, I've given them a high A overall because I think it's worked really well.
And we know you're a hard marker.
Yes. But a softie at heart.
Yes, oh yes. And ride share legislation.
Yes.
So recently, on October 19th, you reintroduced the bill to enable ride sharing in BC. We have a short video clip of you introducing the bill in the legislature.
Member Oak Bay Gordon Head.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I move that a bill entitled the Rideshare Enabling and Increased Taxi Occupancy Act 2017, of which notice has been given, be introduced and read for the first time now. Honourable Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce a bill entitled Rideshare Enabling and Increased Taxi Occupancy Act for the third time. This bill introduces a regulatory framework that would allow ride-sharing to come to British Columbia. Our economy is changing, and ride-sharing is but one example of that change. As legislators, we cannot bury our heads in the sand and ignore this change. We must embrace it and ensure that it leads to the best outcomes possible for British Columbians. Introducing ride-sharing to British Columbia is something that all 3 parties committed to do during the last election campaign. It's time we fulfilled that promise collectively. In introducing this bill, I'm offering a way forward, one that lets us grapple with the questions that this industry presents us with.
The question is first reading of the bill. You have heard the question. All those in favour, aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carried. Member.
I move that this bill be placed on the orders of the day for second reading at the next sitting of the House after today.
You have all heard the question. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carried.
So following your introduction of the bill, you asked the Minister of Transportation a question about it. So what we'd like to know is, were you satisfied with the answer, and why do you think the government does not want it to proceed until they further study the issue? Well,
I wasn't terribly satisfied with the answer that I got. The the government has announced a review of the taxi industry that did not include engaging rideshare companies. Look, we have to realize that these are two very different business models. Around the world, we're the last major city in North America that doesn't have ride sharing happening, and we're trying to brand ourselves as tech innovators, yet we're not willing to embrace the tech innovation. I mean, it doesn't make sense. But the problem here is that in catering only to the taxi industry, you're not actually dealing with the other business model. And it's not as if they compete over each other. I mean, all around the world, taxis are thriving. And so are ride sharing, because there's different types of people. Try getting a cab on a Friday night in downtown Vancouver. It's a safety issue. You know, try getting a cab from someplace if you're in the interior somewhere. You might be no cabs in the small town, but there might be someone who does ride sharing. So it's about providing a service that does not compete head on. It's a different a different business model from taxing, and we need to get with the program. And you know, I like many people listening, I take taxis all the time. I probably will always take taxis. I'm not an app-based person for that. But I asked taxi drivers all across British Columbia what they think, and invariably, if they own the taxi license, they don't like it, but most of the drivers are fine with it. In fact, I was out in the Kootenays recently, and the one driver there was waiting desperately because the driver had to pay the taxi cab owner $100 a day or so for the car, and some days that taxi driver actually lost money because they didn't make it. So it's you know, the problem here is the way we issue licenses in British Columbia. We issue a license as if it's for life and it's a tradable commodity. It never loses value, and you know, we need to really take a look at how we issue licenses here in British Columbia as well.
Yes, thank you. And on the topic of fish farms, can you tell us your position on fish farms and protecting the habitat and migratory paths of our wild salmon?
Well, we've been very clear actually for 5 years as a party that BC Greens would give the appropriate notice to ensure that open net fish farms would no longer be on the wild migratory paths of sockeyes. You know, it's not as if we can't do them on land. There are places where it's already having farms on land. It does not make sense to be putting them on the migratory paths of wild sockeye, especially in light of evidence that would suggest that there's ability for diseases to transfer across stocks, and that's just simply not something we can risk.
And Andrew, the Constitution Amendment Act 2017, you spoke in favor of this bill, which introduces 3 main changes to the Constitution Act. So can you explain to us, please, your support of, firstly, the official party status, changing from 4 elected members to 2 elected members?
Well, for us, party status was obviously pretty important, and there's 3 things in that act. One is the party status, the second is to move the election date to the fall from the spring, and the third is to allow cabinet members to be appointed if someone dies in cabinet. It's kind of a housekeeping. Hopefully it never actually has to be used. I'll ask the first 2. The fall election date is important because every year with a spring election date, we enter into silly season whereby we're having an election campaign without really knowing what the books are. So by having it in the fall, the budget's passed, we've got the end of year records, we actually know what the fiscal situation in the province is. We would have known that there was a $2.8 billion surplus at the time. If instead of kind of guessing that things might be doing well, we would have known that a large chunk of that came from an out of control real estate sector at if we had the information. And so it's critical to move it to October. In terms of the party status, when the BC NDP were in power in 2001, there was only 2 MLAs. And so, you know, in recognition that people run as a party, they're elected as a party, and in our case, we have to serve on every single committee. We have a rather heavy workload. It's important that we're reflected as a political party.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and that's all the time that we have for Constituency Report. But before we go, just want to ask Andrew to fill us in about a town hall that's upcoming in the riding of Oak Bay Gordon Head.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I'm really excited about our town hall, 7 p.m. at the Oak Bay Rec Centre on November the 30th. I hope to give people an update there, listen to the questions, and maybe start the process of engaging them on a discussion of proportional representation. Thank you, Judy.
Thanks very much for watching Constituency Report.